August 19, 1942, jungle near Taivu Point, Guadalcanal. 2nd Lieutenant Genjiro Imai of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company noted in his diary how unsettling his first encounter with American forces felt. Under the dense tangle of palms and vines, Imai and 916 soldiers of Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki's landing force had slipped ashore during the night, an operation Japanese planners believed would be the opening move toward retaking Henderson Field. Intelligence insisted the Americans were perhaps 2,000 poorly trained men, soft from comfortable civilian lives. Even Colonel Ichiki brushed aside cautions to wait for the remainder of his regiment. "They are Americans," he told his subordinates. "Before daylight comes, we will sweep them into the sea." What none of these veterans of the China and Southeast Asia campaigns anticipated was that they were about to face something unimaginable in Imperial Japanese Army doctrine. The coming hours would not simply bring defeat, something they had never experienced since 1937, but the collapse of foundational beliefs about close-quarters fighting, night assaults, and the supremacy of Japanese infantry spirit. The terrain itself turned against them. What Japanese forces once viewed as the ideal environment for stealth would instead become a battlefield that favored American preparation, firepower, and coordination. 2 weeks earlier, on August 7, 11,000 U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division had landed at Lunga Point under General Alexander Vandegrift, beginning Operation Watchtower, America's first major offensive of the Pacific War. Their mission seemed clear: seize the newly started Japanese airfield, expand a perimeter around it, and hold until reinforced. Guadalcanal proved to be an arena more brutal than anything the U.S. Marine Corps had faced. The island, 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, was dominated by ridges shrouded in clouds, with a coastline of swamp, razor-sharp kunai grass, and jungle so thick that a man could vanish 3 feet away. The suffocating heat, relentless humidity, and endless swarms of insects made every movement a trial. Clear rivers that looked safe on maps crawled with parasites. Before the campaign ended, malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and ulcers would disable far more Americans than enemy bullets. Yet on August 7th to 8th, the Marines found the airfield almost undefended. Approximately 2,200 Japanese laborers and 600 naval troops escaped into the interior, leaving behind tools, supplies, and construction equipment. Engineers immediately resumed work, completing the runway within days. It was named Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Soon the airstrip would host the legendary Cactus Air Force. Japan replied quickly, and with devastating effect on American naval forces. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer in a bold nighttime engagement. The resulting Battle of Savo Island became the worst surface defeat in U.S. Navy history. USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMS Canberra all sank within an hour, with over 1,000 sailors killed. American ships withdrew, taking most unloaded supplies with them. The Marines were abruptly stranded, short on food, ammunition, and equipment, while the enemy rapidly regrouped. But the Japanese failed to grasp a critical truth. Whoever held Henderson Field controlled the Solomon Sea during daylight. American aircraft from the airfield could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles. This single advantage shaped the entire campaign. Japanese destroyers could still operate under darkness, runs the Marines called the Tokyo Express, but as soon as morning arrived, American aircraft dominated the sky. Imperial headquarters ordered Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakate's 17th Army to retake the airfield immediately. Yet his available forces were limited. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kyote Kowaguchi was far away at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was still in the Philippines. The nearest was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, originally meant for the Midway invasion. Ichiki, confident in Bushido and night fighting prowess, disregarded his orders to wait. On the night of August 18th, 917 men of his regiment were landed by destroyers at Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. Shortly after landing, he launched reconnaissance patrols. One of these patrols would trigger a chain of events that sealed the fate of his command. On August 19th, a patrol from Company I, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by Captain Charles Brush, encountered Japanese scouts along the coastal track. A sharp, brief firefight left 31 Japanese dead, and, more importantly, documents revealing that a significant enemy force was assembling nearby. The papers also exposed Japan's gross underestimation of American strength. General Vandegrift immediately reinforced the eastern defenses at the mouth of the Tenaru River, actually the Ilu River, though the mistake became immortalized in Marine accounts. Colonel Clifton Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, creating interlocking fields of machine gun fire across the sandbar. Colonel Ichiki, still convinced that American Marines would disintegrate under a night assault, refused to wait for reconnaissance reports or for the rest of his regiment to arrive. Shortly after midnight on August 21st, he ordered his men forward in a direct attack across the Tenaru River sandbar, certain that the spirit and aggression of his troops would overwhelm whatever defenses the Americans had prepared. Just moments before the assault began, Jacob Visa, the Solomon Islander scout who had escaped his Japanese captors despite hours of torture, reached the marine perimeter. Barely able to stand, he warned that a major enemy force was closing in. His message arrived only minutes before the first muzzle flashes lit the night. When the Japanese charged across the sandbar, shouting battle cries and throwing grenades, they ran straight into the overlapping fields of fire the Marines had planned with meticulous care. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns, positioned to sweep the narrow crossing from multiple angles, unleashed sustained, devastating bursts that tore through the attacking waves. A few Japanese soldiers managed to reach the marine foxholes, where violent hand-to-hand struggles broke out, rifles used as clubs, knives slashing in the dark, but the American line held firm. Those who crawled closer met the blasts of 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, which turned the approach into a storm of lethal fragments. By dawn, Ichiki's assault had been completely shattered. More than 800 Japanese troops lay dead or mortally wounded in front of the Marine positions, while American losses amounted to roughly 40 killed and wounded. When daylight exposed the carnage, General Vandegrift ordered Marines from 1st Battalion, 1st Marines to push forward. Accompanied by 5 M3 Stuart light tanks, they crossed the sandbar into the coconut groves where surviving Japanese soldiers attempted to hide. War correspondent Richard Tregiscus, watching the tanks maneuver through the trees, described their canister shells cutting down groups of Japanese soldiers concealed in the brush. By the afternoon of August 21st, the battle was effectively over. Out of the 917 men who had landed with Ichiki at Taivu Point, only around 128 survivors managed to slip back into the jungle. Colonel Ichiki's own death became a matter of conflicting accounts. Official Japanese reports later insisted he burned his colors and committed ritual suicide, while other witnesses believed he fell during the fighting. Regardless of the details, the destruction of his command sent shockwaves through the Japanese high command. Never before had a veteran regiment been all but annihilated in a single engagement. Diaries and post-war accounts reveal the disbelief and alarm among surviving Japanese officers, who struggled to understand how an American force they had dismissed as weak had delivered such an overwhelming defeat. Even more alarming was what Japanese evaluators discovered after studying the battlefield. The Americans possessed a depth of resources Japanese planners had not anticipated. Their machine guns had fired continuously without overheating. Each Marine carried ammunition loads that exceeded what Japanese squads had been issued for entire operations. Artillery support, responsive and lethal, could be coordinated with infantry movements and even naval forces, something Japanese units could not replicate. It became clear that the Americans were not simply tenacious fighters, they were backed by an industrial capacity Japan could not match. Despite the disaster at the Tenaru, Japanese command moved swiftly to send additional troops. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a major naval effort to reinforce Guadalcanal, dispatching 3 transport ships from Truk on August 16 with the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment and 500 naval landing troops. But after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one transport, commanders abandoned the use of slow transports altogether. Instead, they relied entirely on destroyers for the nocturnal resupply and reinforcement missions the Americans would nickname the Tokyo Express. Between August 29 and September 4, this method delivered over 5,000 troops from Major General Kyosuke Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The destroyers could slip through American air coverage under darkness, but they could not carry heavy equipment or bulk supplies. Artillery, tanks, large ammunition stores, motor vehicles, and even sufficient food could not be transported in meaningful quantities. Every Japanese operation on Guadalcanal would ultimately be constrained by this logistical reality. General Kawaguchi, now commanding more than 5,000 soldiers scattered through the dense jungles east of the marine perimeter, prepared for a massive push to retake Henderson Field. Japanese intelligence mistakenly believed the southern edge of the American lines was thinly defended, but marine reconnaissance had already identified the southern ridge as the most likely approach for a major Japanese attack. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, commander of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, confirmed this after discovering large Japanese supply concentrations during a raid on Tasimboko. Edson immediately understood the threat and urged General Van de Grift to let him fortify the ridge. On September 10 and 11, Edson positioned about 840 raiders and parachute marines along the narrow coral ridge. He studied every inch of the terrain, arranging overlapping machine gun fields of fire, registering mortar zones, and coordinating with the 11th Marines to pre-plot artillery barrages that could be fired within minutes. The ridge looked exposed, but Edson understood its tactical value. Anyone attacking up its slopes would be forced into predictable, concentrated approaches where firepower could be devastating. As darkness fell on September 12, Japanese infiltration teams slipped through ravines on both sides of the ridge, probing marine defenses. Moments later, the night erupted in gunfire as Japanese soldiers surged upward, shouting and firing as they advanced. Flares illuminated the slopes with bursts of white light, revealing wave after wave of attackers. Edson's Marines held firm, delivering precise, disciplined fire. Mortarmen dropped shells only yards from Marine foxholes, and machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red. When small groups broke through, Marines counterattacked instantly, often fighting hand-to-hand in the dark with bayonets, knives, and rifle stocks. By midnight, Japanese troops pushed dangerously close to Edson's command post. Edson personally moved along the line, calm, sharp-eyed, rallying exhausted Marines, pointing out infiltration routes, adjusting fire on the spot. The defensive line bent but never broke. At dawn, the battlefield was littered with hundreds of Japanese dead, but the danger had not passed. Kawaguchi still had 1,000 men uncommitted. Expecting another assault, Edson repositioned his exhausted units toward the center of the ridge while reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines arrived. The night of September 13 brought an even more violent storm of attacks. Japanese troops launched repeated charges that reached within grenade range, only to be shattered by coordinated machine gun fire and close-range artillery. At one point, a Japanese breakthrough threatened the entire defense, but Marine gunners and riflemen held the line through sheer determination and discipline. By dawn on September 14, the Japanese attack collapsed. Nearly 850 Japanese soldiers lay dead around the ridge. The Marines suffered over 300 casualties but had survived one of the most intense defensive battles of the Pacific War. For the Japanese survivors, the psychological impact was enormous. They had expected frightened, inexperienced Americans who would crumble under night warfare. Instead, they encountered a force that fought with precision, coordination, and unbreakable resolve. The ridge became the moment many Japanese soldiers realized the war on Guadalcanal would not go as their leaders had promised. The victory at Edson's Ridge did not end Japanese attempts to seize Henderson Field. In late September and early October, fresh Japanese units continued landing at Guadalcanal through the Tokyo Express, destroyers racing down the slot at night to offload troops, but never enough supplies. Every new regiment arrived hungry, already weakened by disease, and carrying only what they could strap to their backs. Artillery shells, heavy weapons, medical supplies, and most of the vital food stock were simply impossible to deliver by fast destroyer. The Japanese were reinforcing the island with men but not with the means to keep them fighting. Despite this growing crisis, Japanese high command ordered a massive new offensive to retake the airfield. General Harakichi Hayate, commander of the 17th Army, arrived on Guadalcanal to personally direct operations. Japanese forces, totaling roughly 20,000, though only a few thousand were fit for combat, prepared for what they believed would be a decisive blow that would break the marine perimeter. The assault began on October 23. Japanese tanks, rare and difficult to land, led an attack across the Tenaru River near the western perimeter. The tanks rolled forward in a tight group, but American defenders were ready. Anti-tank gunners knocked out the lead vehicles almost immediately, then smashed the rest with armor-piercing rounds. Infantry who attempted to follow were cut down by marine machine guns and supporting artillery. The attack crumbled in minutes. But the main Japanese effort was still to come. Far to the south of the airfield, thousands of exhausted Japanese infantry under Major General Yumio Nasu pushed through miles of suffocating jungle. Malaria, hunger, and constant rain had weakened them, yet their orders were absolute: break through the American lines and overrun Henderson Field. On the American side, the defenses were held by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller and the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, supported by the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army. On the night of October 24, the jungle exploded with gunfire as the Japanese launched wave after wave of attacks. American machine guns tore into the advancing columns, but the Japanese kept coming. Several times, the Marines were nearly overrun. Puller moved constantly along the line, directing fire, shifting units, and calling for artillery support from the 11th Marines. Shells rained down so close to Marine foxholes that friendly shrapnel wounded defenders, but it was the only way to stop the assaults. Sergeant John Basilone, already renowned from Edson's Ridge, again became instrumental. When ammunition ran low for his machine gun batteries, Basilone fought through enemy fire to deliver belts and boxes to his crews. When a gun failed, he repaired it in the dark under fire. When a crew was wiped out, he manned the weapon alone. Japanese reports after the battle described the American machine guns as ceaseless and impossible to silence. By dawn on October 25, the Japanese offensive had collapsed. Bodies littered the muddy jungle trails. General Nasu himself had been killed during the attack. American lines held, and Henderson Field remained intact. For the Japanese infantry who survived, the defeat marked another disorienting blow. Night attacks, their traditional strength, no longer guaranteed success. They faced an enemy who could deliver devastating artillery, coordinated machine gun fire, and immediate counterattacks even in pitch darkness. The sea battles that followed only sealed Japan's fate. In mid-November, the waters around Guadalcanal erupted in a series of violent naval engagements that would become known collectively as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers attempted to bombard Henderson Field and land reinforcements. American cruisers and destroyers intercepted them at knife-fight distances in the dark, illuminated only by gun flashes and searchlights. Both sides suffered terrible losses, but the Japanese endured their final, decisive setbacks. The battleship Hai was crippled and later sunk. The battleship Kirishima was destroyed by the USS Washington, whose radar-directed gunfire proved accurate beyond anything the Japanese could match. More critically, nearly every Japanese transport carrying troops and artillery was sunk by American aircraft or naval guns. Hundreds of soldiers drowned. Thousands more washed ashore with almost no supplies. By late November, the Japanese on Guadalcanal understood the truth. They would never retake Henderson Field. They were starving, sick, and out of ammunition. American forces, though battered, were growing stronger by the day, receiving steady shipments of food, artillery shells, medical supplies, and reinforcements. The balance had shifted permanently. As November turned into December, the Japanese position on Guadalcanal deteriorated from crisis into collapse. The defeats in the October ground offensives and the naval disasters of mid-November had severed the last realistic path to reinforcing or supplying the 17th Army. What had begun as a confident mission to sweep the Americans back into the sea had become a slow, grinding descent into starvation and disease. Soldiers who only months earlier marched with precision and discipline were now gaunt, skeletal figures struggling to walk, let alone fight. Japanese diaries captured the reality: daily rations reduced to a single rice ball, then half a rice ball, then whatever leaves, roots, or insects could be found in the jungle. Medical officers recorded hundreds of cases of malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, and beriberi, all worsening because medical supplies had vanished. Quinine, essential for malaria, had run out entirely. Wounded soldiers lay under palm fronds and crude shelters, many dying not from their wounds but from infection and starvation. By late October, more than 60% of Japanese troops on Guadalcanal were unfit for combat. By November, the percentage was even higher. American forces, though exhausted and battered as well, lived in a different world entirely. Henderson Field remained operational, allowing a steady stream of supplies to arrive. Marines and Army soldiers receiving hot meals, rest rotations, medical care, and ammunition saw their combat strength improve while Japanese strength disintegrated. Air superiority ensured safe daylight resupply, while Japanese troops received nothing but occasional, insufficient deliveries from the desperate Tokyo Express. In December, Japanese high command confronted what had become undeniable: the 17th Army would be annihilated if left on the island. The question was no longer how to retake Guadalcanal, but how to salvage what remained of their forces. After months of insisting on victory, Imperial General Headquarters secretly approved a complete withdrawal, an evacuation operation so sensitive it was concealed under the codename Operation KE. Even this evacuation was a nearly impossible task. The Japanese had roughly 11,000 survivors on Guadalcanal, but perhaps only 7,000 could even walk. The rest, crippled by disease or starvation, were too weak to travel. Destroyers would again be used, racing down from the Shortland Islands at night, evacuating as many men as possible, then fleeing before daylight brought American aircraft. While Japanese command coordinated the evacuation, American forces prepared for their own major offensive. By January 1943, the U.S. Army's 25th Infantry Division and the 2nd Marine Division had reinforced the original defenders. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, now commanding 14 Corps, prepared to drive the Japanese completely off the island in a coordinated sweep westward. The offensive began on January 10th. American artillery opened with intense barrages that pulverized Japanese positions. Infantry advanced behind fire and maneuver tactics, pushing through jungle terrain that had been contested for 6 months. What American troops found was a shattered enemy. Many Japanese did not resist; they were too weak to stand. Others fought desperately, clinging to Bushido ideals even as their bodies failed them. The Americans encountered foxholes containing men who had starved to death clutching empty rifles. As the offensive progressed, Japanese rearguard units attempted to delay the Americans long enough for the evacuation to succeed. These defenders, often too malnourished to walk without assistance, fought with a determination born of despair rather than hope. They knew they would not be evacuated. Their sacrifice bought time for healthier troops to reach the coast for extraction. Between February 1st and 7th, 1943, Japanese destroyers made repeated high-speed runs, successfully extracting 10,652 soldiers, one of the most remarkable and dangerous evacuations of the entire war. American forces, unaware at first of the withdrawal, advanced rapidly and by February 9th discovered that the island had been abandoned. For the first time since the campaign began, Guadalcanal was fully under American control. The cost of the campaign was staggering. Japanese forces had committed roughly 36,000 personnel. Between 25,000 and 30,000 died from combat, disease, or starvation. American casualties, though far lighter, were still severe: over 1,600 killed, 4,200 wounded, and many thousands more incapacitated temporarily by malaria and tropical illness. Yet the Americans could replace every division, every ship, every aircraft. Japan could not. Guadalcanal not only marked the first major Japanese land defeat, it shattered the foundation of Japan's wartime strategy. The belief that spiritual strength could overcome material disparity proved fatally flawed. Japanese veterans who survived the evacuation carried with them a realization they had once considered unthinkable: Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The campaign demonstrated the truth that modern warfare was determined not simply by courage, but by logistics, industrial capacity, air superiority, and coordinated firepower. Guadalcanal became the turning point of the Pacific War, shifting Japanese forces onto the defensive for the remainder of the conflict. Those who fought there, on both sides, never forgot what it revealed. The fall of Guadalcanal reverberated across the entire Japanese military structure. What had begun as a confident campaign to crush the first American offensive had instead exposed fundamental flaws in Japan's war strategy, flaws that no amount of courage or discipline could overcome. Survivors of the 17th Army, evacuated through Operation Kei, arrived at Rabaul emaciated, sick, and stunned. Their physical state revealed the truth before they even spoke. The Imperial Japanese Army had not been defeated by lack of spirit, but by an enemy whose capacity for sustained warfare exceeded anything Japan could match. As frontline soldiers gave their testimonies, Japanese officers learned details that contradicted everything pre-war propaganda had claimed. They described American forces that fought relentlessly day and night, retained unit cohesion under extreme pressure, and utilized combined arms coordination with a speed and precision the Japanese could not replicate. They told of artillery barrages that arrived within minutes of request, of aircraft launching multiple daily sorties from Henderson Field, and of supply lines that delivered food, ammunition, fuel, medical gear, and troops regardless of weather or enemy activity. Japanese veterans also explained the psychological shock of encountering American machine gun crews who fought even after their positions were overrun and whose officers made tactical decisions quickly, without layers of hierarchy slowing battlefield reactions. They described Marines who counterattacked instantly even at night, something Japanese doctrine insisted Americans were incapable of. Many admitted that the belief in Japanese night fighting superiority had collapsed completely on Guadalcanal. Losses in the naval battles compounded this realization. Japan had expended elite cruiser crews, experienced pilots, destroyer flotillas, and battleships attempting to retake one island. American industry replaced damaged ships, aircraft, and personnel, whereas Japan's resources dwindled. The Imperial Navy had lost irreplaceable ships during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, while the U.S. Navy continued to grow stronger every month. Air and naval superiority, once contested, shifted decisively toward the United States. Strategists in Tokyo soon faced a grim truth. If Japan could not defeat American forces on a single jungle island, even with elite troops, naval bombardment, and near total night control, it could not hope to stop the United States across the vast Pacific. Guadalcanal destroyed the myth of Japanese invincibility. It also shattered the belief that the Americans lacked resolve. Japanese soldiers who had fought in China and Southeast Asia had grown accustomed to opponents breaking under pressure. But on Guadalcanal, American troops absorbed horrific casualties, disease, and exhaustion, and still continued attacking. American commanders, meanwhile, drew their own conclusions. Guadalcanal proved that coordinated ground, air, and naval operations could crush even deeply entrenched Japanese forces. They learned that Japanese troops would rarely surrender, that night fighting required constant vigilance, and that maintaining aggressive pressure prevented Japanese units from reorganizing. They also learned that Japanese logistics, reliant on courage but not supported by industrial capacity, could be exploited mercilessly. For the United States, Guadalcanal marked the moment the war's momentum shifted permanently. It showed that American infantry, Marines, pilots, and sailors could defeat Japan across every domain of warfare. While the fighting would continue for more than 2 years, the strategic initiative had changed hands. From this point forward, Japan would defend, retreat, and eventually collapse under the weight of American industrial dominance. On the ground, those who survived carried the scars, physical and psychological, long after the war. Marines and soldiers remembered the choking humidity, the endless rain, the stench of disease and death, the constant harassment by Japanese artillery, and the exhaustion that seeped into their bones. Japanese survivors remembered the starvation, the hopeless assaults, the realization that courage alone was not enough. For both sides, Guadalcanal was a crucible, a brutal test that revealed the true nature of modern war. In the years after the conflict, Japanese veterans openly acknowledged what had become clear in the final stages of the campaign. They had not lost because they lacked bravery. They lost because the Americans combined bravery with overwhelming firepower, logistics, mechanization, and air support. Japanese testimonies repeatedly emphasized one point above all others. The Americans fought with a system, not just with individuals. That system, an interconnected machine of ships, planes, radios, artillery, industry, and coordinated leadership, proved impossible to overcome. Guadalcanal thus became more than a battlefield. It became the symbolic turning point of the Pacific War. It revealed that Japan's path to victory had ended and America's path to eventual triumph had begun. From the steaming jungles and bloody ridges of the island emerged the defining truth of the conflict. Modern warfare was ruled not by myth or ideology, but by the nations that could sustain the fight. And at Guadalcanal, the United States demonstrated that it could sustain the fight longer, harder, and more decisively than Japan ever could.